The Story of Civilization, Part 2, The Life of Greece, being a history of Greek civilization from the beginnings and of civilization in the Near East, from the death of Alexander to the Roman conquest, with an introduction on the prehistoric culture of Crete by William. Chapter 17, The Literature of the Golden Age, Section 7. The Historians. Prose was not completely forgotten in this heyday of dramatic poetry. Oratory, stimulated by democracy and litigation, became one of the passions of Greece. As early as 466 BCE, Corax of Syracuse wrote a treatise, Techne Pagon, the art of words, to guide the citizen who wished to address an assembly or a jury. Here already are the traditional divisions of an oration into introduction, narrative, argument, subsidiary remarks, and peroration. Gorgias brought the art to Athens, and Antiphon used the ornate style of Gorgias in speeches and pamphlets, devoted to oligarchical propaganda. In Lysias, Greek oratory became the more natural and vivid, but it was only in the greatest statesmen like Themistocles and Pericles that the public address rose above all visible artifice and proved the effectiveness of simple speech. The new weapon was sharpened by the sophists and so thoroughly exploited by their pupils that when the oligarchic party seized power in 404 BCE, it forbade the further teaching of rhetoric. The great achievement of Periclean prose was history. In a sense, it was the 5th century BCE that discovered the past and consciously sought for a perspective of man in time. In Herodotus, historiography has all the charm and vigor of youth. In Thucydides, 50 years later, it has already reached a degree of maturity which no later age has ever surpassed. What separates and distinguishes these two historians is the sophist philosophy. Herodotus was the simpler, perhaps the kindlier, certainly the more cheerful spirit. He was born in Halicarnassus about 484 BCE, of a family exalted enough to participate in political intrigue. Because of his uncle's adventures, he was exiled at the age of 32, and began those far-reaching travels that supplied the background for his histories. He passed down through the Phoenicia to Egypt, as far south as Elephantine. He moved west to Cyrene, east to Susa, and north to the Greek cities on the Black Sea. Wherever he went, he observed and inquired with the eye of a scientist and the curiosity of a child. When about 447 BCE he settled down in Athens, he was armed with a rich assortment of notes concerning the geography, history, and mariners of the Mediterranean states. With these notes, and a little plagiarizing of Hecataeus and other predecessors, he composed the most famous of all historical works, recording the life and history of Egypt, the Near East, and Greece, from their legendary origins to the close of the Persian War. An ancient story tells how he read parts of his book publicly at Athens, at Olympia, and so pleased the Athenians with his account of the war and their exploits in it, that they voted him 12 talents, $60,000, 1938 US, which any historian will consider too pleasant to be true. Well, I don't know about any historian, because some stuff did happen, to extreme degrees. The introduction announces the purpose of the book in grand style. This is a presentation of the inquiries Historiae of Herodotus, of Halicarnassus, to the end that time may not obliterate the great and marvelous deeds of the Hellenes and the barbarians, and especially the causes for which they waged war with one another, may not be forgotten. Since all nations of the eastern Mediterranean are brought into the narrative, the book is, in a limited sense, a universal history much broader in its scope than the narrow subject of Thucydides. The story is unconsciously unified by the contrast of barbarian despotism with Greek democracy, and moves, though by halting steps and confusing digressions, to a foreshadowed and epic end at Salamis. The purpose is to record wondrous deeds and wars, and in truth the tale sometimes recalls Gibbon's regrettable misunderstandings of history as little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. Nevertheless, Herodotus, though he speaks in only the most incidental way of literature, science, philosophy, and art, finds room for 1,000 interesting illustrations of the dress, manners, morals, and beliefs of the societies he describes. He tells us how Egyptian cats jump into the fire, how Danubians get drunk on smells, how the walls of Babylon were built, how the Masageta eat their parents, how the priest of Athena at Pedasus grew a mighty beard. He presents only kings and queens, but men of all degrees, and women who are excluded from Thucydides enliven these pages with their scandals, their beauty, their cruelties, and their charm. There is, as Strabo says, much nonsense in Herodotus, but our historian, like Aristotle, covers a vast field and has many opportunities to err. His ignorance is as wide as his learning. His credulity is as great as his wisdom. He thinks that the semen of the Ethiopians is black, accepts the legend that the Lacedaemonians won battles because they had brought the bones of Orestes to Sparta, and reports incredible figures for the size of Xerxes' army, the casualties of the Persians, and the almost woundless victories of the Greeks. Well, sometimes people's faith in some objects led them towards certain efforts. So, but, at least the one thing, it's good he didn't try himself to see if, that was true or go out investigating. He was like, oh, okay, I'll just take your word for it. His account is patriotic, but not unjust. He gives both sides of most political disputes, like the imaginative but the excellent discussion of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy in 380 to 82, or to 82, signalizes the heroism of the invaders and testifies to the honor and chivalry of the Persians. When he depends upon foreign informants, he makes his greatest mistakes. So, he thinks that Nebuchadrezzar was a woman, that the Alps are a river, and that Cheops came after Ramses III. I think there's two variations of Nebuchadnezzar, and in between the two variants is the number value 666 or something like that. But when he deals with matters that he has a chance to observe in person, he is more reliable, and his statements are increasingly confirmed as our knowledge grows. He swallows many superstitions, records many miracles, quotes oracles piously, and darkens his pages with omens and auguries, and gives the dates of Semele, Dionysus, and Heracles, and presents all history. Well, those figures probably had a historical origin, and they were divinized over time. Like a Greek, the so, as the drama of divine providence, rewarding the virtues and punishing the sins, crimes, and insolent prosperity of men, but he has his rationalistic moments. Perhaps having heard the sophist in his latter years, he suggests that Homer and Hesiod gave names and form to the Olympian deities, that custom determines men's faiths, and that one man knows as much as another about what are considered to be the gods. Having accepted Providence as the final arbiter of history, he puts it aside and looks for natural causes. He compares and identifies the myths of Dionysus and Osiris in the manner of a scientist. He smiles tolerantly at some tales of divine intervention and offers a possible natural explanation. Miracles don't have to be outside of natural law. They're just, And he reveals his general method with a twinkle in his eye when he says, I am under obligation to tell what is reported, but I'm not obliged to believe it. And let this hold for every narrative in this history. He is the first Greek historian whose words have come down to us, and in that sense, Cicero may be forgiven for calling him the father of history. Lucian, like most of the ancients, ranked him above Thucydides. Nevertheless, the difference between the mind of Herodotus and that of Thucydides is almost the difference between adolescence and maturity. Thucydides is one of the phenomena of the Greek Enlightenment. That descendant of the sophists, as given, was a spiritual nephew of Bayle and Voltaire. I originally read the Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire in 6 volumes. I have a summary on my bookshelf. I don't know if it's old enough to share, but his father was a rich Athenian who owned gold mines in Thraca. His mother was a Thracian of distinguished family. He received all the education available in Athens and grew up in the odor of skepticism. When the Peloponnesian War broke out, he kept a record of it from day to day. In 430, he suffered from the plague. In 424, age 36 or 40, he was chosen one of 2 generals to command a naval expedition to Thraca. Because he failed to lead his forces to Amphipolis in time to relieve it from siege, he was exiled by the Athenians. He spent the next 20 years of his life in travel, especially in the Peloponnesus. To this direct acquaintance with the enemy, we owe something of the impressive impartiality that distinguishes the book. The oligarchic revolution of 404 BCE ended his exile, and he returned to Athens. He died, some say by murder, in or before 396 BCE, leaving unfinished his history of the Peloponnesian War. He begins it simply. Thucydides, an Athenian, wrote the history of the war between the Peloponnesians and the Athenians from the moment that it broke out, believing that it would be an important war and more worthy of relation than any that had preceded it. He opens his introductory narrative where Herodotus left off at the close of the Persian War. It is a pity that the genius of the greatest Greek historians saw nothing worthier of relation in Greek life than its wars. Herodotus wrote partly with an eye to entertain the educated reader. Thucydides writes to furnish information for future historians and the guidance of precedent for future statesmanship. Herodotus wrote in a loose and easygoing style, inspired perhaps by the rambling epics of Homer. Thucydides, like one who has heard the philosophers, the orators, and the dramatists, writes in a style often involved and obscure, because it attempts to be at once brief, precise, and profound, a style occasionally spoiled by Gorgian rhetoric and embellishment, but sometimes as terse and vivid as Tacitus, and rising in the more crucial moments to a dramatic power as intense as anything in Euripides. Nothing in the dramatist can surpass the pages that describe the expedition to Syracuse, the vacillations of Nicias, and the horrors that followed his defeat. Herodotus ranged from place to place and from age to age. Thucydides forces his story into a rigid chronological frame of seasons and years, sacrificing the continuity of his narrative. Herodotus wrote in terms of personalities rather than processes, feeling that the processes operate through personalities. Thucydides, though he recognizes the role of exceptional individuals in history, and occasionally lightens his theme with a portrait of Pericles or Alcibiades or Nicias, leans rather to impersonal recording and the consideration of causes, developments, and results. Herodotus wrote of far-off events reported to him in most cases at second or third hand. Thucydides speaks often as an eyewitness or as one who has spoken with an eyewitness or has seen the original documents. In several instances he gives the documents concerned. He has a keen consciousness for accuracy. Even his geography has been verified in detail. He seldom passes moralistic judgments upon men or events. He lets his patrician scorn of Athenian democracy get the better of him in picturing Cleon, but for the greater part he keeps himself aloof from his story, gives the facts with fairness to both sides, and recounts the story of Thucydides, his brief military career, as if he had never known, much less been the man. He is the father of scientific method and history, and is proud of the care and industry with which he has worked. On the whole, he says, with a glance at Herodotus, the conclusions I have drawn from the proofs quoted may, I believe, be safely relied upon. Assuredly, they will not be disturbed either by the lays of a poet displaying the exaggeration of his craft, or by the compositions of the chroniclers that are attractive at truth's expense, the subjects they treat being out of the reach of evidence and time having robbed most of them of historical value by enthroning them in the region of legend. Turning from these, we can rest satisfied with having proceeded upon the clearest data and having arrived at conclusions as exact as can be expected in matters of such inquiry. The absence of romance in my history will, I fear, detract somewhat from its interest, but if it be judged useful by those inquirers who desire an exact knowledge of the past as an aid to the interpretation of the Father, which, in the course of human affairs, must resemble, if it does not reflect the past, I shall be content. In fine, I have written my work not as an essay which is to win the applause of the moment, but as a possession for all time. Nevertheless, he yields accuracy to interest in one particular. He has a passion for putting eloquent speeches into the mouths of its characters. He frankly admits that these orations are mostly imaginary, but they help him to explain and vivify personalities, ideas, and events. He claims that each speech represents the substance of an address actually given at the time. If this is true, all Greek statesmen and generals must have studied rhetoric with Gorgias, philosophy with the Sophist, and ethics with Thrasymachus. The speeches have all the same style, the same subtlety, the same subtlety, the realism of view. They make the Laconian as windy as any sophist bred Athenian. They put the most undiplomatic arguments into the mouths of diplomats, i.e. the speech of Alcibiades at Sparta, 6/20/89, and the most compromising honesty into the words of generals. The funeral oration of Pericles is an excellent essay on the virtues of Athens, and comes with fine grace from the pen of an exile, but Pericles was famous for simplicity of speech rather than for rhetoric, and Plutarch spoils the romance by saying that Pericles left nothing written, and that of his sayings hardly anything was preserved. Thucydides has effects corresponding to his virtues. He is as severe as a Thracian, and lacks the vivacity and wit of the Athenian spirit. There is no humor in this book. He is absorbed in this war, which Thucydides is the historian, a proudly recurring phrase, that he has an eye only for political and military events. He fills his pages with martial details, but makes no mention of any artist or any work of art. He seeks causes sedulously, but seldom sinks beneath political to economic factors in the determination of events. Though writing for future generations, he tells us nothing of the constitutions of the Greek states, nothing of the life of the cities, nothing of the institutions of society. He is as exclusive towards women as towards what are considered to be gods. He will not have them in his story, and he makes the gallant Pericles, who risked his career for a courtesan, advocate of feminine freedom, says that a woman's best fame is to be as seldom as possible mentioned by men, either for censure or for praise. Face to face with the greatest age in the history of culture, he loses himself in the logic-chopping fluctuations of military victory and defeat, and leaves unsung the vibrant life of the Athenian mind. He remains a general even after he has become an historian. And of course, women, like everybody else, gets credit for what they support, what they encourage, however you're going to phrase that. We are grateful for him, nevertheless, and must not complain too much that he did not write what he did not undertake to write. Here, at least, is an historical method, a reverence for truth, an acuteness of observation, an impartiality of judgment, a passing splendor of language and fascination of style, a mind both sharp and profound, whose ruthless realism is a tonic to our natural romantic souls. Here are no legends, no myths, and no miracles. He accepts the heroic tales, but tries to explain them in naturalistic terms. As for who are considered to be gods, he is devastatingly silent. They have no place in his history. He is sarcastic about oracles and their safe ambiguity. Remember what Nostradamus said with his things. He always said stuff that was so vague that was going to come true eventually. And a bunch of people jousting. Oh, I hear this guy has gold on his helmet, so I'm going to write a poem about that. And it's like, oh, he's a prophet. It's like he was going to come to a tragic end eventually, right? And scornfully exposes the stupidity of Nicias in relying upon oracles rather than knowledge. He recognizes no guiding providence, no divine plan, not even progress. He sees life and history as a tragedy at once sordid and noble, redeemed now and then by great men, but always relapsing into superstition and war. In him, the conflict between religion and philosophy is decided, and philosophy wins. Plutarch and Athenæus refer to hundreds of Greek historians. Nearly all of them, but Herodotus and Thucydides in the Golden Age, have been covered up by the silt of time, and of the latter historians only paragraphs remain. The case is no different with the other forms of Greek literature. Of the hundreds of tragic dramatists who won prizes at Dionysia, we have a few plays by 3. Of the many comic writers, we have 1. Of the great philosophers, we have 2. All in all, not more than 1/20th survives from the critically acclaimed literature of 5th century Greece, and from earlier and later centuries even less. Most of what we have comes from Athens. The other cities, as we can tell from the philosophers that they sent to Athens, were fertile in genius too, but their culture was sooner engulfed by barbarism from without and from below, and their manuscripts were lost in the disorder of revolution and war. We must judge the whole from the fragments of a part. Even so, it is a rich heritage, if not in quantity, but who has absorbed it all? Surely in form and order are the essence of the classical style in literature as well as in art. The typical Greek writer, like the Greek artist, is never satisfied with mere expression, but longs to give form and beauty to his material. He cuts his matter down to brevity, rearranges it into clarity, transforms it into a complex simplicity. He is always direct and seldom obscure. He shuns exaggeration and bias, and even when he is romantic in feeling, he struggles to be logical in thought. This persistent effort to subordinate fancy to reason is the dominant quality of the Greek mind and even of Greek poetry. Therefore, Greek literature is modern, or rather contemporary. We find it hard to understand Dante or Milton, but Euripides and Thucydides are kin to us mentally. They belong to our age, and that is because, though myths may differ, reason remains the same, and the life of reason makes brothers of its lovers in all times and everywhere. And their quality is 7 times as bad right now as it was a year ago, so if there's been trouble in my speaking, I'm trying to hold off a sneeze and all that.